Getting a new bike is a really exciting time, no matter if it's brand new or second hand, but it's well worth spending a little bit of time to make sure it's all safe, but also getting it set up so it works perfectly for you. So the very first thing I'll do is actually make sure all the bolts and everything is tight on this bike. I know if you've bought the bike from a shop, then they should have done that already. And some of these bolts you're gonna have to undo again to try messing around with settings, but you don't want to damage anything when you're jumping on and off the bike if it's not done up properly in the first place. So with the full bolt check done, I would say the next thing to do is to check your tyre pressures. So personally, I look for about 30 PSI in the rear and 28 in the front. This bike's a Scott Genius LT Plus, so I've got plus size tyres in here. So I do go slightly lower, actually quite a lot lower, go down to about 20 PSI in the rear and about 18 in the front. It's also a good time to check if you've got tubeless. I know a lot of brand new bikes don't come set up as tubeless, so it's well worth thinking about. So the easiest way to check if you're tubeless or not is just to undo that nut that's on your valve there and push it down. If nothing leaks out like that, nothing coming out of there, I know that's an inner tube just with that bolt on it. If you undid that lock nut on tubeless and pushed the valve, you'd actually hear some air coming out, but also with this, I can feel the tube pushing it back up. So I definitely know this has got a tube inside this tyre. So it's probably worth me thinking about changing this to tubeless. We've already done a video about tyre pressure, so you might want to check that out. So we talk about different types of riding disciplines, different riders' weight. So have a look at that for more in-depth feature about setting your tyre pressure. Whilst I'm at the wheels, I'm going to check the axles are tight. I've got a Maxol on the back here, so no tools needed. Just give that a push by hand. Check that's tight. Also check the front one. Same on this Fox fork. It's quick release through axle, so they're nice and tight. Now I'm going to whip the bike off the stand and set my suspension. So suspension, again, we've done a full in-depth video on this, but first thing to do is to set your sag. So rear suspension, just lower yourself on. I do this sat down on the saddle, and you look in for about 30% sag with all your weight on the bike, which mine looks pretty good. But yeah, if it's a new bike, something you're definitely gonna have to do. And on the fork, I look for about 20 to 25% sag. You may also have some clickers on your suspension, so compression and rebound damping. If you don't know what you're doing with those, I would say check out the actual manual to your bike, and it'll probably say wind those clickers all the way in and then a certain amount of clicks back out, and that's always the best place to start. So the next thing I set up is actually the handlebars. So to do this, I'll get my seat nice and low and actually jump on the bike, and the first thing I will set is the handlebar roll. So especially if you've got riser bars, it's worth trying to get these in the right spot before you do anything else, like playing around with the actual bar controls. So I'm undoing the stem bolts. This is where you can make sure that the bars are centered in the stem, and now actually just roll the bars. Like I say, with riser bars, the first thing I do is actually try and get the rise to go directly up, and then I'll actually ride the bike. You can play around with that roll a little bit. So if the bike feels a little bit cramped, roll the bars forwards, can give you a little bit more space. If you feel a little bit stretched out, you can roll the bars back a little bit just to pull them a little bit closer to you. So because these bars are actually flat, what I'm looking at is the sweep. So that is how much they sort of bend back. You see here and here they bend back. I'm trying to get that sweep coming back and up slightly. I don't want that sweep to be down or up too much. So I'm just rolling the bars until I find that sweet spot, and they're just sort of pointing to the back of the bike and up slightly. Just make sure when you're tightening up this stem faceplate that you make sure all these bolts are equally tensioned and that faceplate isn't touching the stem at the top or the bottom. And they only need 5 Newton meters on these, so that's not very tight at all. Next thing I will set is bar height. So I've got a couple of spacers underneath my stem, a big one, then a smaller one. And this really comes from experience. I'll jump on a bike and I'll sit down and I'll sort of have a feel that, you know, I know where those bars should be. If I want them to go lower, what I can do is just undo these pinch bolts, and then the top cap, slide the stem off, and then put one of these spacers on top just to lower the bars a little bit. So to get the headset back to the correct tension, I'll wind a bit onto that top cap, and I'll actually check, and I try and get it tight enough so there's no play back and forth if I grab the front brake, but not tight enough so you feel any bind on those bearings. Get the stem straightened by looking down the back of the bars, and then I'll tighten that stem back up. We can talk a lot about handlebar height, and again we have done a video on that, but generally speaking, higher handlebars are better for riding downhills. It tips that weight further back, but less good for cross country as the weight's too far back, and it also takes a little bit of weight off that front tyre. So bear that in mind. You want that bike to feel balanced in the conditions you ride it in. Whilst you have the stem off, it might be worth checking the grease in your bearings on the headset. If it's a new bike, it should be fine, but definitely if it's a second-hand bike, because you've got the stem off anyway, you're almost halfway there, just give that headset a clean and a re-grease. Whilst I'm still on the bike, now it's time to set up the handlebar controls. So I always start with the brake levers. So get them in the right spot. I always try and get my one finger right on the very end of that lever for maximum leverage. And then also in on the bar and the angle. So again, angle sort of does depend on the discipline of mountain biking you do. Slightly higher for downhill probably, so you spend more time off the back of the bike, but just make sure your levers are in a really nice position so you can get hold of them easy enough. After the brake levers, I will then set up my dropper remote lever and then the gear shifters. Finally, for the shifter, I only have one on this bike because it's a 1x setup. So the right hand shifter I actually like tipped up quite steep, so then when I'm out the saddle sprinting, I can still reach it. If it's too far flat, I'll miss it. On this SRAM X01 shifter, you can also adjust that bottom paddle so you can spin it around so you can reach it. I like mine fairly low underneath the bar, but just so I can actually, a full stretch of my thumb, I can push it up 2 gears. If you have asymmetrical grips like these ergons, it's almost like bar roll. I've undone it and I can just rotate them around the handlebar to get that most comfortable fit. So next thing to do is to set your saddle height, and this is for maximum pedaling efficiency but also for comfort. So you want it relatively high, but too high and it's going to hurt your hips and knees. So you're looking for a slight bend in your leg when you have your pedal at the lowest position. Also set your saddle position and angle so you can slide it forward and back on the rails. Sliding it forward is going to make it slightly shorter up front so they reach your handlebars, and also get you sat slightly in front of the pedal, so good for climbing. Further back is going to give you more space. So you just need to undo these bolts on your seat post. I like to set mine completely in the middle, go for a ride and then maybe change afterwards. Also the angle, I like to set it pretty flat. For downhill you might want it slightly nosed up, so it's easier to get off the back of the bike, or cross country even slightly nose down so you can get a bit more weight to the front for climbing. Okay, I'm going to put the bike back into the work stand for a few final checks. So now to set up your chain device, if you have one on this, it's a 1x11 setup, so I do. This has actually quite a nice little guide on it, so it tells you, depending on the size of your chainring, where to set it, but you don't always have to rely on that. So this is 30 tooth, and I'll just get that pointing to the 30. But what you're looking for is that when you're moving around on the block, so from the very top to the very bottom, that the chain isn't rubbing at all on that guide, but it's close enough to hold it onto that chainring. Now to the gears, start with your rear mech and set the limit screws to stop the chain from jumping off the bottom or over the top and into the wheel, and also set the B tension on the mech, and that controls how far back that mech rotates. So you need to rotate it further back for these larger cassettes where you've got that big spread, and a bit closer to the cassette for smaller cassettes. Next, check that your calipers are centered so that your disc brake spins nice and freely through them without touching the pads, and the gap either side from the pads to the rotor is the same. Now to your pedals. On flat pedals you can adjust these pins in or out, so having them further out is going to make them protrude more, obviously. That gives you more aggressive traction on your bottom of your foot, but it could be slightly more uncomfortable. You can also play around with these on some clipless pedals where you've got the clip in the middle, and just really think about adjusting that grip that you feel through the bottom of your foot. Just now time to put a bit of lube on the chain and take it for a ride. So there you go, ready to ride. I will always take a multi-tool with me, especially on the first ride, just to adjust things that I maybe didn't quite get set up perfectly in the workshop. If you haven't done already, click on this GMBN logo to subscribe. It's totally free. There's a couple more videos you might find useful. Click up there for how to set up your rear mech, where I go into detail about the screws, B tension, high and low limits, those sort of things. And if you click down there, that'll take you through to how to center your disc brakes. Give us a thumbs up if you find this video useful.